All right, chapter 14 is the last part of the executive branch we're going to cover before the executive part of the Constitution test. Basically, we're going to just go over the president's powers. So, Article 2 of the Constitution creates the president. However, the Constitution gives the president presidential powers a lot of wiggle room. It doesn't spell out exactly what powers the president has. And so we're left with this ongoing debate between people who think we should have a strong president that leads from the front and other people who think that the president should be a servant of the people and should kind of step in line with Congress. Over the past 200 years, the president's power has grown dramatically. Most of this power kind of surged in the 1920s because one, you had the presidency taking a lot of power from Congress. Because of the Great Depression, he was able to kind of get away with more things than he had been in the past and was given more responsibility in kind of pushing programs through Congress and stuff like that. And then in the 1920s, also we had the advent of the radio, which allowed the president to communicate with the entire country at the same time. Before that, people would hear about what the president was doing, or they would read it in the newspaper, or the president would do something, make a treaty with another country, and then it would be in the newspaper a week later. Now the president is going on the radio and addressing the entire country at the same time. It was added more of a leadership dimension to the presidency than there had been previously. Now, there are two general philosophies on how the president should do his job. One is the president is a steward and he should have commanding presence and kind of lead the country where it needs to go. The other philosophy sees the president as kind of a servant of Congress and the people, and he should just be there to enforce the laws that Congress puts into place. The president has a number of different powers based on his the 8 roles we went over in the previous video, or in the previous chapter. The first one, he's the chief executive, which means he has the responsibility for carrying out all the laws that Congress writes. Congress writes the laws, president enforces the laws. Now, the president has to enforce laws whether he agrees with them or not. The president also has ordinance power. This comes from the bureaucracy that he's in charge of. The president has a cabinet. The cabinet has members in it such as the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Homeland Security, etc., etc. The president has power over all those people and tells them how to do their job. The president also has the ability to do something called an executive order, in which is something that the president says, and just because he says it, it's put into law. So a great example of this would be the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. He just came out and he said, hey, all the slaves in states still rebelling against the Union are free. Boom, all those slaves are free. It's a law, just like that. That's what an executive order is. It's a very important power of the president. He also has appointing power. Here he appoints key officials such as ambassadors, judges, cabinet members. He also has removal power. Anybody that he appoints, he can have removed. So if he appoints somebody to the cabinet, he can remove them from his cabinet. The exception being federal judges and independent regulatory agencies. He also can't remove the vice president. Vice president can't be fired. He also has diplomatic powers. That means the power to make treaties, to negotiate international treaties, comes from the Congress. Okay, so Congress Senate has to approve, using a 2/3 majority vote, treaties set up by the Secretary of State. But the president has something called the executive agreements. They're kind of like executive orders, where the president can go over to the leader of, say, China and say, hey, we're going to negotiate this deal, blah, blah, blah. And then just because the president says it's a deal, it becomes a deal. It's like executive agreements are like mini treaties. President also has military powers. He is the commander-in-chief. So only Congress can declare war. But once Congress declares war, the president is in control of military. Like I said, only Congress can declare war, but the president often uses the military without formal declaration of war. So Vietnam, we never formally declared war, but it was the Vietnam War. Iraq, we never formally declared war. It wasn't declared by Congress, so we were never in war. What the president calls those are military conflicts. In reaction to Vietnam, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in '73, which required the president to inform Congress of any commitment of U.S. troops abroad within 48 hours. So the president isn't supposed to just send military personnel wherever he wants. He's supposed to get congressional approval. Does that always happen? No. All that means, though, is that it's not officially a war sanctioned by the U.S. government. He also has legislative powers. Now, he doesn't have direct legislative powers, but he can influence legislation by sending out messages. He's the head of his political party, and so when he goes out and says, hey, as all Republicans are going to, push for this, or when President Obama comes out and he says, hey, all Democrats are going to get on board with the Affordable Care Act, and we're going to push this through Congress. He has the ability to do that. The president also can make suggestions about financial goals for the year. He can also veto legislation sent to him by Congress. So the major check that the executive branch has on Congress, the major check the executive branch has on the legislative branch is the president's ability to veto laws passed by Congress. He can also propose laws to Congress. He submits a federal budget to the House of Representatives. And he appoints federal officials. The executive checks on the court system, on the judicial branch, is he can nominate judges to the U.S. Supreme Court. He can nominate judges to federal court system, and he has the power to commute a sentence, to pardon people, to grant amnesty, and to reprieve. Those are basically when people have committed a crime, the president says, hey, they're not going to get punished. Those are all different ways of saying that, pretty much. And yeah, the president normally doesn't do that because he can't just let people off the hook for crimes. So usually, if he's going to commute a sentence, or if he's going to grant a presidential pardon, or grant some sort of reprieve from a sentence, it usually happens in the last couple weeks of his presidency, because if he does that during his presidency, it's less likely he'll be returned to office. It's less likely people will vote for him again. And that'll finish up the executive branch.